Welcome everybody to a meeting of the Boston Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Mueller, I represent Secretary Pollock here. Consistent with the Governor Patrick's executive orders during COVID-19, we are holding this meeting virtually. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your full name and organization so we can see and call on you. Also, if you're a member, please put MPO member in your name. I will conduct a roll call for all to get a quorum and then for all MPO votes. To participate in the discussion, MPO members will be prompted to raise your hand. I will then call on you, and the same procedure will be used for members of the public. So I believe we'll take the roll call vote now. Can somebody, oh wait, let me read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Regine Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or at 857-702-3704. Thank you. Now go ahead and please call the roll.
Okay, MassDOT Chair.
It's David Mueller, I'm here.
Thank you. MassDOT second seat.
I'm not seeing John Bouchard in the meeting.
Okay, MassDOT Highway.
Is John Romano here?
John Romano. Okay, MBTA.
Hi, this is Samantha Silverberg, MBTA.
Thank you. Massport. Okay, MAPC. Okay, MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, present.
Great, thank you. RTAC, Advisory Council.
It's Advisory Council here.
I think I hear you, Len. Are you here?
Inland said he was here.
Okay. City of Boston, BTD. Is Tom here? Okay. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, Jim Fitzgerald with EPDA representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston. I'm pretty sure Tom is patched in too, so maybe try him again later.
Okay, we'll do. At large, City of Everett.
Jay Monty, City of Everett.
Thank you. At large, City of Newton.
David Kosas, at large city, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller, City of Newton.
Thank you. At large, Town of Arlington.
At large, Town of Arlington, Daniel Amstutz, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Wonderful, thank you. At large, Town of Lexington.
Richard Canale for the Town of Lexington.
Great, thank you. Inner Core Committee, Somerville.
Tom Bent, representing the City of Somerville, Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Great, thank you.
Jonathan, you're muted.
Oh,
No, you're not. Now you are again.
okay. Metro West Framingham.
Patrick Keys is here, Framingham representing Mayor Spicer.
Thank you, sir. North Shore, Beverly. Okay, North Suburban, Woburn. Okay, South Shore, Rockland. Okay, Swap, Medway. Okay, Trick, Norwood, NRRC.
Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood representing Trick Subregion.
Thank you, sir. I will go back. It looks like Mass Highway is here. I'm sorry, Mass DOT Highway Division. John Romano looks like he's here.
John Bouchard is who we were looking for, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I'm here.
Thank you.
John Romano
Tom?
was also, John Romano was
Oh,
also-
John Bouchard is here. Okay.
and John Romano is also here. If you could unmute him.
I'm here if you can hear me.
Thanks, John.
Yes.
We heard you.
Yes,
John.
we heard you.
All right, my screen is gone, so I can't see you for some reason.
Okay.
So you
Massport.
got both Johns, right, Jonathan? You got John.
I do. I
Bouchard.
have both John Bouchard and John Romano. Yes, I
Okay.
do. Massport.
Hi there, this is Laura Gilmore from the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Thank you. And MAPC.
Eric Barassa from MAPC is here. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have
Tom
any
Katz
other.
is- Jonathan,
Oh,
Tom
Tom.
Katz is here if you could call him.
Yes, Tom. Tom Katzis.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Tom Katz is here, representing Mayor of Boston.
Thank you, Tom. So I don't see any other hands raised, but I have Magic, Acton. Have you jumped on board? Okay. North Suburban, Woburn. North Shore, Beverly. South Shore, Rockland. And Swap, Medway. Looks like that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody. The next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one, so we'll go right into the executive director's report. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you bear with me just for a couple of quick minutes, I just wanted to mention that this is our first meeting, our first board meeting since our new manager of the Transit Analysis and Planning Group has started, Paul Christner. So you should be able to see him in the attendees if you scroll through, if you're able to see people's video. So please welcome him. I'm sure many of you will be talking to him throughout the coming months. The next thing I wanted to do is just to address the two comments that came up during the last meeting related to technical difficulties in the Zoom meetings and also related to communication with project proponents, because we committed to following up on these and we just wanted to report back. So first, in terms of technical difficulties, I certainly acknowledge how incredibly frustrating that can be. We aren't aware of additional kind of systemic technical difficulties, but if you have any difficulties, we're working harder now just to try to remind you, putting Rasheen Foley's contact information in the agenda itself, and we'll also try to message it throughout the meeting just to make sure people have the best chance they can to sort of see that information and reach out. We absolutely want to make sure that those technical difficulties do not get in the way of effective participation. So please make sure you contact Roisin Foley or Kate White. You can do that by phone, email, or chat. So let us know if you have any questions. And then also in terms of, there was a comment about miscommunication with project proponents. We did work to track this down, and we are very committed and continue to be committed to make sure that the processes with the MPO are transparent and inclusive. And we did identify that it was a misunderstanding and thankfully not a miscommunication. But at the same time, please make sure you continue to provide us feedback if you think that we have missed a communication point, or if there's ways that we can work to continue to improve the way we communicate with members and project proponents. So I just wanted to wrap those up in case there are any questions from last meeting. Today we have, as has been the case, a very full agenda, including we're going to wrap up the major infrastructure conversation and also more TIP criteria discussion. We're having a lot of discussion on the TIP criteria, and we're trying to keep the meetings to a manageable length. These are really important conversations, but we're recognizing how much time that they're taking up. So we're going to try to tighten up the conversations that we're having at the MPO board meetings themselves, and then open up more opportunities to attend focus groups as we have in the past to kind of get into the specifics in more detail. So over the next 2 meetings, we'll discuss system preservation and capacity management criteria and the equity sort of overlay onto both of those groups. And if it's too quick, so that we can keep to meeting time, we will hold a focus group in July, and we'll sort of work through additional questions and comments. So please give us your feedback on whether or not you feel like you've been able to kind of have that conversation thoroughly with us. And we'll also discuss more specifics in terms of point allocations at those focus groups. And we'll probably continue that conversation into August. So anyway, we'll follow up with a doodle poll in the coming days, so keep an eye out for that so that we can try to schedule a focus group. So please do look for that and respond. I think that's it. The next meeting will not be until July 16th. We are skipping the 2nd because it is a holiday week. And then the next meeting after that will not be until August 6th. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, Mr. Chair.
Tegan, any questions for Tegan? If so, raise your hand. Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Does anyone from the public want to make a comment at this time? If so, please use the raise hand function. Seeing none. If you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Next up is the committee chairs reports. Are there any? Seeing none. Next up is a report of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Lynn?
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there was no meeting, but I want to let people know that at our next RTEC meeting, we are going to be meeting with Betsy Harvey to talk about TIPS criteria a lot. And I really want to encourage people to join us at that meeting. Not so much board members, although you're always welcome, any members of the public, because as we know, these criteria are very important and they give us the real input into the process by which projects are selected. So everyone's welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next up is the approval of the minutes of May 14th and May 28th. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of May 14th? If so, please state your name, and also if you make the second, please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
This is Eric Barassa, MAPC. I make a motion to approve the MPO minutes.
Brian Kane.
I enthusiastically second Eric Barassa's motion.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second to approve the minutes of May 14th. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions from members? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Mr. Chair, would you like to just do one roll call for the minutes, and we can do a vote, or do you want to do them individually?
I want to do them individually in case people have changes to either one of them.
Okay, we'll do. Matt Chair?
Yes.
David Moeller? John Bouchard?
I'm sorry.
John Bouchard, yes.
If MPO members could all raise your hands so they can find you and unmute you easily, that will make it easy for all of us. Thank you. Keep going, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
No problem. John Romano? Unmute.
Somebody unmute John, please.
I am trying.
Thanks. All right, go to the next person, John, while they try to unmute.
Okay.
John.
All right. Samantha Silverberg?
Yes.
Laura Gilmore?
Yes.
Eric Barassa?
Eric Barassa, yes.
You, Len Diggins? Len Diggins, my apologies.
Len Diggins, yes.
Okay. Brian Kane, I'm sorry, I skipped over.
Jonathan, I thought you liked me, man.
I do. I just looked at the wrong line. My apologies.
No worries. Brian Kane, yes.
Okay. Tom Katzis,
Tom Kansas, yes.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
50 yes.
thank you. Jay Monty,
Yes.
thank you. David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Richard Canale,
Richard Canale, yes.
thank you. Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Patrick Keyser, yes.
thank you. And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Great. Mr. Chair, I do know that Mr. Miller has come from Federal Highway. I see his name in the list. I don't see any other members who have attended, who jumped onto the meeting, unless
Okay,
I'm missing it.
Were we able to get John Romano unmuted?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so John
Rashid?
Romano, please record your vote in the chat function, please. Second motion, can I get a motion and a second from a member? Please state your name and making it to approve the minutes of May 28th. Eric Barassa. I guess it's not Eric Barassa. Can two people please raise their hands to make the motion and second for the May 28th meeting minutes?
Got a Daniel Amstutz, I believe.
Good.
Daniel Amstutz, so moved.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, second.
Thank you both. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, will all the members please raise your hand because we're going to do a roll call. Go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry, Jonathan.
No problem. David Mueller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
Yes.
thank you. Can we try John Romano again? See if he is able to unmute. Okay, I'm guessing that's not working.
All right, just keep going.
Okay,
John.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
thank you. Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
thank you. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes. Thank you.
thank you. Len Diggins.
Len Diggins, yes. And I thought you just liked me better than Brian. But that's okay.
Oh, now. Tom Kansas,
Tom Kansas, yes.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yep, yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
you. Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Richard Canale,
Richard Canale, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Thank you. Have we had any luck with Mr. Romano unmuting?
He appears to have left the meeting.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks, everybody. Next item on the agenda is the work scope for the International Review of Vision Zero policies. Bradley Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm here to present a work scope for an international review of Vision Zero policies. As you may recall from discussions earlier this spring, this year's UPWP had previously programmed $60,000 for a study of transit mitigation. And as the board discussed earlier this spring, that work on that topic is being conducted by other agencies. And so it was thought that the work would be duplicative for, it would be duplicating work for the MPO to do the same work. And so the thought was to reallocate that $60,000 to other purposes. So on June 11th, this board voted to approve a scope that would use $30,000 of that dollars on a review of innovative practices in trip generation to help with projecting trip demand for new developments. And so the scope before you now is a review of Vision Zero policies that would make use of the other $30,000. And so, as you know, Vision Zero is a policy goal in which a city or a region aims to reduce its transportation-related fatalities to zero. A number of cities and towns over the last few decades have put into place Vision Zero policies, including a number here in the Boston region. And every city has made its own choices about which Vision Zero strategies would fit best into their policies, such as reducing speed limits or right-sizing roads that have additional lanes, or investing in bicycle infrastructure or pedestrian infrastructure, or undertaking more comprehensive education campaigns. And so each city or town chooses which policies fit best according to its local circumstances. And so what we propose to do in this scope is to look at cities in other parts of the world that have experienced dramatic reductions, in some cases all the way to zero, of their pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. We want to see which strategies those cities employed that were most effective in making those large reductions in fatalities. And so we want to assemble a toolkit that would have a list of possible strategies that cities and towns in the Boston region could consider adding to their existing policies, or if they're looking to create a new policy. And in preparing the scope, staff have had initial conversations with folks working on Vision Zero policies in the city of Boston, in the city of Cambridge, and the city of Somerville. And we look forward to, if the scope's approved, we look forward to continuing those conversations and guiding this work. So we're looking for you to approve this scope, but before that, are there any questions?
Are there any questions from the members? If so, please raise your hand. Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve as presented today? Please raise your hand. Eric Barassa.
I make a motion to approve this work scope.
Ryan Kane.
Ryan Kane, seconds.
Please, every MPO member, raise your hand so we can do the roll call. When you're ready, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
thank you. John Romano,
He's
I'll
still
come
out
back.
gone, Jonathan.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Len Diggins,
Len Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Chad says yes.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monte, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Richard Canale,
Richard Canale, yes.
thank you. Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Thank you. That motion carries. Next item is the federal fiscal year 2020 UPWP Amendment Number 2. Sandy Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am going to present to you Amendment 2 to the Federal Fiscal Year 2020 UPWP. You've already heard the important points of the content of this amendment from Bradley, but now I'm going to ask you to formalize the changes through the UPWP. The motivating factor behind these changes is the need to amend out the discrete study called Transit Mitigation for New Development Sites due to redundancy with work being carried out at MassDOT. That budget line is funded at $60,000. This amendment takes out the transit mitigation study and replaces it with two $30,000 studies, review of Vision Zero policies, and innovations in estimating trip generation rates. The MPO has actually already seen the work scopes for both of these studies, and thanks to Bradley for presenting the Vision Zero scope just now. Since the MPO has discussed the scopes already, I'm not going to spend time describing the content here. Descriptions of the new tasks and redlined explanations of what will change in the document are available in your handout. That's attachment 6 under the meeting calendar. On the meeting calendar, there's also posted a version of the full FFY 2020 UPWP, but the packet handout just contains the relevant pages. Just a word on process. The UPWP committee has discussed the need to amend out the transit mitigation study and potential replacements at several meetings. It also signed off on this amendment at its meeting earlier this morning. With that, I'm happy to take questions. If there are none, I request that the MPO vote to release Amendment 2 to the FFY 2020 UPWP for a 30-day public comment period. We expect after the public comment period, the MPO will vote to endorse this amendment on August 6th, after which it will be reviewed by Federal Highway Administration.
Thank you, Sandy. I just have a quick question. The agenda says it's 21-day public comment period. You just said 30. Which one is it?
It is 30. Our apologies for the agenda being incorrect.
No worries. Thanks, Sandy. Are there any questions from the members? Jim Fitzgerald has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to basically make a request that we get an update as to the work that I think it's MassDOT planning that is doing instead of the transit mitigation scope that this work is replacing. So just wondering if anyone knows what the status is of that work, and if not, if we could get an update in one of the upcoming meetings.
Yeah, we'll get you an update in one of the upcoming meetings. Thanks, Jim. Any other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to release this for a 30-day public comment period? Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I make a motion to release this for a 30-day public comment period.
Tom Bent.
I make a motion to second this.
Thank you. Motion being made and seconded. Please call the roll, Jonathan.
David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano, is he back? Okay, I'll come back. Samantha Silverberg, I know she may have stepped away. Okay, Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
thank you. Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
thank you. Brian Kane,
Brian King, yes.
thank you. Len Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Chad, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
thank you. Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Richard Canale,
Richard Canale, yes.
thank you. Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
And thank you. And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Thank you. That motion carries. Can you put the next page of the agenda up, please?
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item is the Transportation Improvement Program Amendment Number 6 for FFY 2020. Matt Genova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello, everyone. For my first presentation today, I'll give you an overview of Amendment 6 to the federal fiscal years 2020 through 2024 TIP. This comes fast on the heels of Amendment 5, which was released for public review by this board at the June 11th MPO meeting. There are two tables posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date that detail the contents of Amendment 6. One table is a summary of the amendment itself, and the other is the full TIP tables with the amendment included. Amendment 6 includes 4 projects, 1 highway project and 3 transit projects, all in federal fiscal year 2020. Beginning with the highway project, 1 new project is being added to the TIP, or is proposed to be added to the TIP, which is a bridge maintenance project on 3 bridges on Interstate 93 near the Boston-Milton border. This project is proposed for funding using statewide highway infrastructure program, or HIP funds. The total cost of this project is approximately $11.5 million. On the transit side, 3 Metro West RTA projects are proposed for addition to the TIP. The first is the purchase of 6 Type E and 8 Type D compressed natural gas vehicles, all of which are fully accessible. This project is proposed for funding using roughly $1.1 million in FTA 5339 bus and bus facilities funds, with the matching funding coming from toll credits. 2 MWRTA operating assistance projects are also proposed for funding in Amendment 6. These projects aim to increase evening and weekend service on high ridership MWRTA bus routes, and will also provide for a study to analyze the feasibility of adding Sunday service to certain routes. Both projects are funded through discretionary grants from MassDOT's Rail and Transit Division. The combined total cost of these projects is just under $600,000. Pending a vote by this body, Amendment 6 will be released for a 21-day public review period, putting it on track for a final vote at the July 16th MPO meeting. That's all I have on TIP Amendment 6, so with that, I will turn it back over to the chair for questions.
Thank you, Matt. Any questions from the members? Leonard Diggins.
Just want to say that I really support the RTA amendments, and it's unfortunate though that we are in this era with the pandemic, because I think that's going to really make it hard to ascertain any results. Or it's going to be hard to assess meaning to the results. But I've always favored expanding service on weekends, especially because right now I think a lot of the thinking is that we don't have the demand on the weekends, so why provide the service? But if the service isn't there, of course, there's going to be a demand, and always I'd like to see a bit of a commitment so that people can feel that the service is going to be there in order to feel that they should use it. Because if you don't think a service is going to be there for a substantial period of time, you're not going to use it, and that can also skew the results. But again, I mean, I'm really happy to see this kind of work being done, especially with RTAs. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Any other questions from the members? Thatcher Keyser.
Yeah, another question. Just want to also echo the last comments that supporting, especially the increased services on weekends. Lynn nailed it. You got to have the buses to have the ridership, and you get the ridership when you have the buses. So support the efforts of the Regional Transit Authority.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from MPO members? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to release this for a 21-day public comment period? Thatcher Keyser.
I make a motion to advertise this.
Thank you. Eric Barassa.
I second that motion.
Motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll.
David Moeller.
Yes. All MPO members, please raise your hand so we can unmute you. Thank you. Go ahead, John.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano. I thought I saw him come back. Okay. Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Kansas, yes.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Richard Canale,
Richard Canale, yes.
Tom Ben,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser, I think he was on
Yeah,
mute.
I'm a yes, and I'm going to keep my hands off the pedals for voting.
Okay, all right. And Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
okay,
you.
motion
Motion
carried.
Romano,
yes, if you can
Oh, John Romano, yes, thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Sorry.
Next item is a major infrastructure.
David just got muted.
Am I unmuted now? I think I am.
You are, yes.
Next item is major infrastructure definition, Ann McGann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm waiting for my, okay, so Matt, I just want to make sure that I can control it. If not, I'm going to have you do it.
Go for it. You should be good.
Yeah.
Not
it's
working?
not working for me.
I control it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I don't know what it is, but it never works for me. So hi, everyone. I'm here again to talk about the MPO's major infrastructure project definition in the long-range transportation plan. Next, please. So I'll start by recapping what the MPO has discussed to date. The definition of the major infrastructure project as identified in the MPO's long-range transportation plan is a project that changes capacity to the transportation network and/or costs more than $20 million. We've been discussing this item over the last year, beginning in November of 2019, when the MPO discussed whether the current definition should continue to include the $20 million threshold. And at that time, the MPO did vote to continue including this threshold in the definition. So the issue arose again in spring of 2020 during discussions regarding the Transportation Improvement Program amendment, when cost increases caused 3 complete streets projects to reach the $20 million threshold. So this required the MPO to amend the LRTP. So at that time, the MPO questioned whether complete streets projects that cost over $20 million should be included in the major infrastructure program or in the complete streets program, because including them in the major infrastructure program would affect the funding goals for investment programs that were established as part of the long-range plan. We again discussed this issue at the May 14th MPO meeting, and members expressed support for increasing the threshold amount to $50 million. The chairman conducted a straw poll asking members if they agreed with that threshold, and most members were in agreement, with some preferring no threshold at all. So at that time, the chairman asked staff to provide members with the federal requirements for a major infrastructure project. So we're here again today to continue that discussion and hope to vote on a final definition. So we posted a handout on the meeting calendar for members to follow along during this discussion. Next slide, please. So the Federal Highway Administration provides a definition for what they call regionally significant projects, which is shown here on the screen. This definition is included in its federal air quality conformity regulations, and regionally significant projects are required to be included in the region's travel demand modeling efforts. So the full definition is a project that is on a facility that serves regional transportation needs, such as access to and from the area outside of the MPO region, to major activity centers in the region, to major planned developments such as new retail malls and sport complexes, or to transportation terminals. So at a minimum, all principal arterial highways and all fixed guideway transit facilities that offer an alternative to regional highway travel need to be included in the region's travel demand model. So any changes in capacity to these facilities must be included in an air quality analysis required for federal review. So analyses for the Boston Region MPO are done using the statewide travel demand model, which represents the highway network, including all roadways classified as collector or higher, and all MBTA rail and bus lines and commuter boat services. So for roadways, this includes interstate highways, arterials, which also include express highways that are not designated as part of the interstate system, and collector roads, which are important because they connect with arterials. Next slide, please. So in addition, FHWA identified specific projects that are exempt from regional modeling emissions analyses, and the categories of exempt projects are shown here on this slide and also in your handout. Next slide, please. So with that as background, staff recommends to use the current definition of a major infrastructure project as one that changes the capacity of the transportation network, and then add if it is on a facility that is included in the statewide travel demand model. So this would include projects with changes in capacity to interstate highways, arterials, and collector roadways, and all changes to the MBTA's fixed guideway transit facilities. We also recommend that a threshold cost of over $50 million be included in the definition as discussed at the May MPO meeting. And this would allow members to consider the higher cost projects prior to programming in the TIP. Next slide, please. So this last slide shows an example of projects that are currently in the LRTP and TIP to illustrate how this would change the status of projects that are currently classified as major infrastructure project in our documents. So Ferry Street and Route 126 are considered major infrastructure projects now because they cost over $20 million. Because they don't change the capacity of the transportation network, they would be considered complete streets projects under the new definition. The Boston Street Bridge project would remain a major infrastructure project because it adds capacity to the network, even though it costs under $20 million. And then the Rutherford Avenue project reduces capacity and it costs over both of the threshold amounts, so it would remain in the major infrastructure program. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand it back to the chair for any questions and discussion. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ann. Questions from members? If so, please raise your hand. Then Diggins.
I support this, but just a quick curiosity question, intellectual question. Can you just give me an example of a collector roadway, one or two examples, just so that I have a sense of what they are? Thank you.
I'll have to get back to you on that.
No problem. I thought because I was a transit guy, I thought I'm just kind of ignorant of these things. So I was just trying to get a sense. I have a sense of the arterials and of course the major ones, but no problem. Thank you. I was just curious more than anything else.
Other questions? Ken Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions. It's not clear to me why you would include projects that are on collector roads, because by definition, they're not really regionally significant. Just because your model, they're in the model, yeah, I beg you to say you may have some local roads that are in your network model. You have a very disaggregate network, and I don't know necessarily that projects on collector roads would be regionally significant. And then you also mentioned something about all projects that change capacity. So you showed the Boston Street Bridge that may change capacity, but I would venture to say it's not regionally significant. Something that has to be modeled, it has to be modeled for air quality. That doesn't mean, I guess the federal definition doesn't mean that this MPO has to adopt that as its definition of major infrastructure. I mean, this MPO can do what it chooses. I mean, it does have to be modeled, that's the requirement, but that doesn't mean that the MPO has to choose to define it, a project like that, as major infrastructure. And I would venture to say you have some complete street projects that actually may reduce capacity, and nobody, I don't think, would say that those would be major infrastructure projects. And then I would have a question about where a project such as an interchange improvement that costs less than $50 million, where would that project be categorized? It's not a complete streets and it's not over $50 million. Where would it be?
Right. So for the New Boston Street Bridge, that actually is a connection to the Anderson. It's the Anderson intermodal facility up in Woburn. So I would think that that would be a major infrastructure project. It provides another access to that point. We've always kind of, if we can include it in the model, and if it's as far as for the tip and the plan, if it's eligible for federal aid, then we've always kind of included any project that adds or changes or capacity to the network as part of the plan, as long as I've been working on it. So if it can be modeled, if it's eligible for federal aid, I think that, we've always included that as a definition in major infrastructure. For interchanges, I guess I'd have to see. So if it's an interchange reconfiguration, which is one of the exempt projects that's included in that definition, I guess we'd have to talk about, where that would be included if it was under $50 million. And if I guess it would also have to add, if it adds capacity, then it would be included as a major infrastructure project. If it is just reconfiguring, then it would be, exempt as part of the federal regulations from the modeling efforts.
Right, but so what I think Ken is trying to get at, well, there's more than one thing, but on this question, is there a gap where we will find ourselves with a project that doesn't fit into any of our definitions? If there's an interchange project that, let's say, costs $40 million, okay? It's therefore not a major infrastructure, so we've now defined it, but it's also not a complete streets, and it's not a transit modernization. Where would it reside?
Yes.
I think I'd have to think about that. Yeah. I think as part of, right. And I guess as part of our discussions, right. I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, we can't vote on this today. We can't vote ourselves a policy that leaves a gap where someone on this MPO wants to say build an interchange, and it's not 50 million, but it's not a major infrastructure, but it doesn't fit anywhere else. So we're sort of like, well, what are we supposed to do with it?
Right. And I guess if you're building an interchange, if it's a new interchange, it would definitely be a regionally significant, a major infrastructure, because
right,
it's adding.
But I'm not, I'm not really building any new interchanges by and large. I'm not me personally. We may or may not want to, as an MPO, reconstruct some, and then they may come in at under 50. And the question is, what do we do with them?
Right, and that's kind of when we did our, for charting progress, when we decided that we weren't going to, we wanted to do the lower cost complete streets, intersection, and bike and ped projects, and the larger interchange and those type projects, was the policy. That doesn't mean they're not going to come they're not going to be submitted for to the MPO for consideration. So.
Right. Well, and it's also not true that we're doing lower cost complete streets projects exclusively. We're doing some really high expensive complete.
Right.
Streets. that theoretically
Right.
could be pretty close to some interchange projects depending on how you design them and what you're doing there.
Right.
Right, and the complete streets can compete. They're in a program. The interchanges are sort of left out there in limbo, not even knowing what project you should be judging it against.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Ken.
So again, I think based on what you're proposing, you're pretty much defaulting to the $50 million as a definition. Because it's any project that's on a collector, any project that changes, because I would say that the Boston Street project, I wouldn't consider that as a major infrastructure, regionally significant project. It does, according to the federal definition, change capacity and connect to a facility, but it's not really, so I wouldn't consider it significant enough. Again, I think you should try to craft a definition of major infrastructure that's related to the functionality of the project. And it may be, maybe that you can't necessarily define everything, something that's so airtight that it's either is or it isn't based on, some formulaic or definition, but you know it when you see it kind of thing. So McGrath Boulevard, Rutherford Avenue, Canton Interchange, Green Line Extension, whatever, those to me would be regionally significant. And I don't know if, because they're on regionally significant facilities and they affect the region. And so I think it would be better to come up with something that is related to the significance of the project rather than what facility it's on necessarily or the price tag. Thank you.
You're welcome. Others? David Kozis.
So as an example, the Newton Corner Improvement Project, it's kind of a complete streets project. It's probably, I would think under $50 million, but it is on the interstate network. It's on I-90. It might add capacity, maybe not. So, where would a project like that fit into this? It seems like it should not have to be considered a regionally significant, major infrastructure project.
So are you saying it shouldn't be?
I don't think it should be.
It should be.
Think? I think it should not be.
He's saying it should not.
Well, it's unclear. What would it be?
Well, I guess we had this discussion as part of the LRTP where you don't really have the design yet for that. And it's, and this could also be an interchange because it's kind of at that interchange, exit 17.
Right, so it's clearly on I-90 and it's in the model. So does that automatically mean that it's regionally significant and needs to be, an major infrastructure project?
Well, I guess it depends on what the design, and I think that's what we decided as part of our discussions for the plan is what is the design going to be for that? Is it just, that could potentially be an interchange reconfiguration, depending on the cost and depending on the, what the actual improvements are for that.
Okay, but so I think these two questions are sort of getting at the same issue of how are we categorizing things?
Right.
And just so I'm clear, and I understand that this is all based on the discussion from last week where the MPO said we don't want to get rid of our threshold, let's just increase it. But any project that's over $50 million, whether it's a complete streets or some other type of project, would automatically qualify as a major infrastructure. Yes?
Yes.
And any project under $50 million that is regionally significant for the model would also qualify?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanna make sure.
Changing capacity to projects that can be modeled.
Right. Okay.
which is basically what we do now, except we're changing the threshold up to 50 million.
Lynn Diggins, I'll get back to Ken, but Lynn Diggins?
Actually, could you take Ken first, please, and then I'll talk after Ken?
Sure, Lynn.
Thanks.
Ken.
Okay, thanks, Len. So just a question then about, actually, I lost my train of thought. Go ahead, Len.
No problem. It's just generally, yeah, I learned from your questions, and a lot of times what you'll say, it's like whatever I was going to say, it's not going to be relevant. So that's why I was doing that. But anyway, so really what we were getting at here was that we were concerned about complete streets being priced out of that category into major infrastructure. So that was a problem I thought that we were trying to solve. And of course, whenever you try, not whenever, but sometimes when you come up with a solution, it creates other problems. I get that. But do we now have like a good definition for complete streets, so that we know that that's a complete street, even if it is over more than 30 million, let's say, so that because we're just trying to create some headroom for allowing a project to increase its cost without then throwing it out of its original category. So if we have a definition for complete streets, and all the other things, then almost by process of elimination, anything that doesn't fit into another category is going to be a major infrastructure project. And I know that on its face, that's a bit of a stretch of a statement, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, we have a definition of complete streets to incorporate, all modes, auto, transit, bike, ped. So we have that as part of the LRTP. And as just going back a little bit as well, as part of our discussions for the LRTP, we were talking about different investment programs that we presented. And one of them was actually an interchange investment program, which the MPO decided not to go with that particular investment program. So just if you look in our universe of programs in the LRTP, that what had been included, but we did add this time the transit modernization program, but we didn't add an interchange improvement program.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Other questions? Oh wait, I do see other questions. Oh, Kim Miller, you got your hand raised again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a senior moment there, sorry. I guess the question I had was related to projects that have to be modeled because they change capacity. So for example, you couldn't have a complete streets project, maybe a road diet project that reduces capacity that you would have to model, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I wouldn't think that would be considered a major infrastructure project either. So, I mean, it's a complete streets project. So if your definition is projects that have to be modeled, I think there are some inconsistencies there also. Thank you.
Right. And we have, if it reduces capacity, road diets, we include those. Obviously Rutherford Ave fits into major infrastructure anyway, but that reduces capacity. McGrath Highway. So that is included. So I guess, we have always, as long as I've been here, if it changes capacity, we have included it in the model. And I would argue about the new Boston Street Bridge because it may not, it's regionally significant in that area, because now people can get off of 93 at a different interchange and get into Anderson if that connection is there. And I know that people in Woburn and Wilmington are happy about that, diversion as well. So
right, but so that's sort of missing the point though. Ken's point, and I'm not sure I agree with it or not, but Ken's point isn't that you shouldn't model them and include them in the plan, or that they're not regionally significant for air quality. The point is major infrastructure may not be equivalent to regionally significant for modeling purposes. You
Right.
could make the case, and we might disagree, Ken and I, on this, but you could make the case that the new Boston Street Bridge, although regionally significant for air quality and significant for local access to Anderson, is not regionally significant for local access to Anderson or regionally significant for traffic movements. Regionally significant, and therefore wouldn't be a regionally significant quality project and would just have to go in through the plan in some other way and would always, of course, have to be modeled. Eric Barassa?
Thank you. So I kind of have I guess a process question, because I kind of agree with Ken that there is a sense that there are projects where you sort of kind of know it when you see it and say, yeah, this seems regionally significant and this seems more locally significant, and it's hard to have a very strict kind of definition. And I wonder, is just if we set this kind of policy guidance, are we then, does it then have to be black and white? Like, well, it's $50 million, more or less. So it has to, or can we have the flexibility to make those decisions on a case by case, process?
Right. Well, I think that goes to what's the point, right? My assumption is that the point the MPO is trying to make is there needs to be a pot of money somewhere so that the $50 million projects aren't competing against the $5 million and the $10 million. And that pot of money is there for those big projects that we all agree we want to do, go over there and compete against other projects. But I'm not sure that's what the point is, because theoretically you could just have a, and I don't remember what are our pots of money for the LRTP project specific? Like, we divide our 100% funding between those pots. What are they? What are the programs?
I think it's, if I remember, I'm kind of having a senior moment. I can look it up in the plan behind me, but it's no more than 30% for major infrastructure. I think it's 45% for complete streets, 10%, 2% each. Hold on, it's 2% for community connection, 5% for, sorry, I'm having a senior moment. I think it's 10% for bike and ped, 45% for complete streets. I know it's no more than 30% for major infrastructure. 2% for community connections.
Transit modernization.
What am I, here it is. I got it.
Okay, good.
All right, let me read it to you so we know. 45% for complete streets, 13% for intersection improvements, 5% for bike and ped, 2% for community connections, and 5% for transit modernization, and then no more than 30% for major infrastructure.
Okay.
So potentially, what we're missing here are major interchange, well, not major, but interchange program. So like major infrastructure could potentially be over $50 million, and then everything else would, I'm sure we might be missing something if it came up, but if you had a major interchange or an interchange program, then that could catch all of the things you were talking about, Ken.
But is the
David.
Is the point here that really, like, it's almost like there's sort of a little bit of semantics. Like, is it really about calling it major infrastructure, or is it really just about calling it like very expensive projects?
Right.
Like, and having, I don't know, just some distinction there. Because obviously the more programs you create, then it kind of, it's sort of saying like, well, we are expecting to fund these types of programs.
Right. So, and I think that we didn't go with the interchange program because the MPO wasn't, maybe we thought that others would fund those, but, and that was part of the scenario planning that was done for charting progress, where we looked at these higher cost projects versus the operations and management type projects, the complete streets, the, you know, intersections and bike and ped and community connections, and decided that those were the types of projects that the MPO wanted to fund, and not necessarily a lot of these big high cost projects. And then again, we brought up the interchange program as part of Destination 2040, and the MPO chose not to have an investment program for that.
Right, so without a major infrastructure program, if we didn't have one, Rutherford Avenue and McGrath would compete as complete streets?
Correct.
Okay. Where would 126, 135 compete? Or the Canton interchange, I mean, pick either one, I don't care. Or the intersection project?
Canton would be one of the interchange. It would be an interchange, which the MPO said they weren't going to have an investment program for that. The 126, 135 could potentially be an intersection.
Okay. But what makes those both, so I think I'm making an assumption. I think everybody would look at the Canton interchange or the Woburn interchange and say, if you had a program for major infrastructure, clearly they're major infrastructure, right?
Correct.
Probably regardless of cost. If it was 49 million or it was 127 million, it's a major infrastructure project, right? You're making significant changes to the network. But something like 126, 135, without a threshold dollar amount, would that be a major infrastructure project, or would that just have to compete against intersections? Because that's sort of like, I think that's part of what we need to figure out is where do projects and project types fall based on this definition or any other definition of major infrastructure.
Right, because that actually is, you know, it includes transit at that, but it's not really changing the network. It's just easing the flow of traffic in that area and potentially the flow of, you know, transit as well.
And it also may or may not include transit. The original design was 135 and 126 and not transit, not grade separating the transit. But regardless, it may or may not. Eric, you still
we're right back to where we started here, I guess. And as you said, like Eric, that it's definitely a case by case. It's really hard to put a specific definition on it, because as you said, when you see it, you know it's regionally significant.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to the point David made earlier, you know, it's in my experience on the MPO for the past 11 years is that we have a hard time saying like no to things in general. And I think the way that we prioritize is when we can see all the projects that are competing for the funds. And so I think with the plan, my experience with that has been there's like, you know, only a few projects that are like meet the criteria of regionally significant, and then all these constituents come forward and want their project. And so I agree with the point that we should be looking at what is the complete kind of field universe of projects there, and I think raising the cost of it addresses it to some extent, but doesn't completely. And yeah, so I apologize. I don't have the answer here, but I think these are all important questions.
And I think that, can I just add something to that? So in the past, people wanted to have their projects in the plan, because once you get in the plan, as you said, you don't take anything out of the plan. So, but at that point, when you're looking at projects that are like not going to be ready for the next 10 or 15 years and you're putting them in the plan, then they're there. And then we generally don't bring them out. So if you have a smaller pot of what we consider regional or major infrastructure, or have to put it in the plan, although if it changes capacity, I believe that we have to put it in the plan for air quality purposes. Then if you have a smaller pot of these major infrastructure projects, as these projects come through design, we actually can look at them at that point, because we know a little bit more about the project instead of having put it in the plan already, and then it goes through design, and then we basically put it into the tip. If you have a smaller number of these projects, then you actually let the tip do its job. When it comes in with the design, you have these criteria, and you can actually evaluate these projects with more information and decide whether you want to fund them as part of the tip.
Good point.
Lynn?
Hi, I was still kind of processing what Ann said. Yeah, I think I got it. Like I said before, the issue that precipitated this was that we had some complete street projects that went up in cost and then made an major infrastructure project, and then we had our weighting for major infrastructure higher than what we had intended. And so I know one of the things that the advisory council is really concerned about is that we just don't have enough money left over for the small projects that we feel really meets a lot of the goals that we are really focused on, like for pedestrians and bikes and also complete streets. And so it's really the cost of the projects that's the problem. We feel that we just can't have a few high cost projects eating up the entire budget for the MPO for a given year. So that's what I'd like to see us work to solve for. Thank you.
You're welcome. Tegan, you have something you want to say?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think I would love to turn it over to Jonathan, since he's a co-host, he can't raise his hand, but I think this is a great conversation about the intricacies, and we may want to suggest ways that we continue to try to follow up and wrap this up. I think it's a little overcomplicated, for where we are today. But Jonathan, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, may Jonathan speak to that?
Sure, Jonathan.
I was going to suggest the same thing, that we as staff could go back and take what we've heard today and talk about it more, and come back to the MPO at a later time with, a new presentation for this.
So what did you hear today that you're going to go back and talk about? Like my understanding is the MPO at the last meeting did some straw poll where they said, hey, we like a $50 million threshold. There's a whole line of conversation now that seems to me to say, why are we having a threshold again? Does threshold make sense? I'm happy to be done now and let you guys go off and talk, but what are you actually, what issues are you going to try to address when you go off and talk as staff?
I think that some of what I'm hearing is whether we need to possibly look at renaming some of the categories that we have, or even some of the pieces with it. And I don't know if you want to add to that, but I'm wondering if that might be a way to come up with a solution.
Well, I think I could summarize all of the points that were made today. As far as, we did, let me know. It says my internet is unstable. Let me know if you're not hearing me.
Okay.
Summarize the information that we heard. There's a lot of different points, and send it out and let people look at this, and because it's really as far as developing new categories, that's what's done as part of the LRTP. And I guess if you wanted to do an amendment, we did talk about specifically the interchanges, which the MPO decided that they didn't want to put have that as part of an investment category. So that was a policy that's already been made. So we could summarize all of what we heard and discuss as staff and then bring it back, I guess. And we could have, set aside more time to talk about this. And if anybody wanted to provide comments as far as what they think, we could pull that all together.
Okay, so that's fine. But I need you guys, when you're off talking about it and thinking about it, to do some kind of matrices to make sure you're not leaving projects out. Okay.
Right.
So, and I understand that ultimately the MPO may again decide to leave interchanges out, but I don't think you should design a process where there's no place for a $40 million interchange to get funded.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
The MPO can then decide, you know what? Either MassDOT rebuilds the interchanges or they don't. It's not our problem if that's what the MPO wants to decide. But I don't think you should presume that's the decision, even though we've made policy decisions
Right.
in advance, because this is a whole discussion about policy. I'd also
Right.
like you
We
guys,
can provide.
I'd like you to do
I'm
some
just saying.
analysis. I'm sorry, Ann, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. We can provide all of that background information as what's been done, what we talked about, and what is needed.
Yes, and also I'd like last thing I'd like you to do is think about some project-specific issues, like I threw out 135, 126, and I threw out McGrath. But there's also that Lynn project that it was funded in the plan of a major infrastructure, but would not necessarily, maybe would or would not have, to Lynn's point about large projects eating all the budget, survived into the Complete Streets program because it would have eaten all the money. So do some thinking about some specific projects of, in the future, this project currently, like that chart you had, this project currently was funded as major infrastructure. In the future, it would have to compete here, right? This project funded here, in the future, it might have to be a major infrastructure. So we can have some kind of, at least, we can look at facts and talk about them and then maybe come to that thing of, we'll have a, who knows, maybe we'll ultimately have a program that says we know it when we see it. Samantha Silverberg.
And I can look at the universe of projects and try and see what we have out there that we have.
Okay, Samantha?
Yeah, just, not to immediately advocate for one more process over all the other processes we already have, but, perhaps when staff see a project that's an edge case, rather than it automatically going into one category or another, that could be something that comes to the MPO and we can have a discussion, because, I think we want criteria so that for the majority of projects, we know what bucket they fit in. But I think we shouldn't, immediately eliminate the idea that we may need to discuss some things. And in the future of transportation, there may be, major infrastructure projects that don't fit into any of what we're talking about, So, I think that we don't need to be perfect in what our rules are. And perhaps, part of what we build in is, if staff determine that something is on the borderline or is not neatly categorized, the MPO board, may vote on what LRTP category the project fits in.
Excellent point. Thank you, Sam. Any other comments or questions before we wrap this one up and let staff go off and think some more about it? Seeing none. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Can we put the agenda back up, please? So the next item is the TIP project selection criteria public outreach summary. Kate White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate White. I'm the Public Outreach Coordinator for the Boston Region MPO. Today I'm going to talk to you about the public outreach process we conducted last fall to hear input on transportation priorities to inform the proposed changes to the TIP criteria. You've already heard from my colleagues Matt Genova and Betsy Harvey about some of the initial results. So today I'm primarily going to talk about what strategies we employed, the themes that came out of the comments, the demographic information of the online survey respondents, and the next steps in this process. Posted to the calendar is a memo that contains all this information about our whole process and the responses received in the focus groups and online surveys. So please check that out to learn more. Sorry, just bear with me. I think I'm set to go. There we go. So last fall, staff set out to conduct a combination of in-person and online public outreach. We hosted 7 focus groups with advocacy and civic engagement organizations and released an online survey. Both the online survey and the focus groups included one main question that asked participants to choose their top priorities out of a list of 15. This list of 15 you've seen in previous presentations, but they consist of current TIP criteria goals and other priorities identified in the long-range transportation plan. Online survey respondents were asked to choose both their top 5, then their top, and then additional comments or additional priorities to be considered. Focus group participants were asked to choose 3 priorities, rank them, and provide additional notes and comments. For the focus group, staff worked to specifically connect with groups that primarily serve equity populations, as well as to broadcast the survey in their social networks and email lists. We hosted 3 focus groups with Union Capital Boston at their Mattapan, Jackson Square, and East Boston monthly network nights. And then we hosted focus groups with Blue Hills Regional Coordinating Council, Boston Core Regional Coordinating Council, Transit Matters, and Livable Streets Alliance. This outreach effort resulted in 93 participants in the focus groups and 462 online survey respondents. So you all have seen these tables before, but I wanted to highlight again what came out of the list of 15 priorities. So respondents primarily selected larger thematic priorities, with improving pedestrian safety being the most selected in the online survey and the second most selected in the focus groups. Promoting more equitable mobility was the most selected during the focus groups and the second most selected in the online survey. Maintaining the existing transit system and prioritizing buses with dedicated bus lanes were among the most selected priorities in the focus groups. However, in the online survey, maintaining the existing transit system was the most selected top priority, by far above others. More respondents in the online survey selected reducing emissions and pollution, but in the comments, many respondents advocated for investment in transit, pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure to support reducing emissions, enhancing climate resiliency, and promoting equity. Many reiterated the Boston region's congestion issues, but advocated for expanding bicycle network connectivity, improving access to transit stations, enhancing connectivity to jobs and services, and improving safety for all modes as ways to combat congestion. Many respondents urged the MPO to prioritize investments in areas that have been historically and currently underserved, and improve transit in low-income and primarily people of color communities. They also argued for weighing more heavily the negative impacts of projects and adding more criteria to address air pollution. So the online survey had several demographic questions included, and this demographic information helps us identify more who we are reaching and where we have gaps in outreach. The demographic questions included race and ethnicity, sex, age, income, location by zip code, and household size. Here are some highlights, but again, all of this is in the memo if you want to dive deeper into the details. So for race and ethnicity, this question was answered by 453 respondents. And so you can see in the table here, for comparison, the minority population in the Boston region is 28.2% of the total population. So you can see the online survey respondents skewed more white. The question on age was completed by 460 respondents. Apart from the age bracket of 18 to 24 years old, which only comprised about 3.5% of respondents, there was little variance in the number of respondents in the age brackets. No respondents identified as under 18 years old, so there's a gap in youth engagement there. 460 respondents completed the question on sex. Results were generally proportional to the Boston region population. Staff also asked respondents to share their zip code of their home residence. Zip codes were provided by 434 respondents. Here's a map of the Boston region zip codes with municipalities and MAPC subregions. The highest number of responses came from zip code areas in Arlington, Somerville, Cambridge, Jamaica Plain, and Wellesley. And although staff received responses from every subregion, there were zip code areas that were not represented in the survey. So we didn't hear from communities like Lynn, parts of Quincy, and some municipalities in the Trick, Swap, and South Shore subregions. So learning about these gaps in outreach, we will conduct more intentional outreach in the areas that had low or no response rates, as well as areas that are home to a higher proportion of equity populations when conducting the second round of TIP criteria feedback, as well as into the future. So we organized all the data into the MPO goal categories to help with identifying input and proposed changes. You'll see many of the comments covered multiple goal areas, which shows the intersection of people's priorities. For clean air, sustainable communities, participants advocated for dramatically reducing emissions and pollution and recommended improving pedestrian and bicycle safety, increasing pedestrian and bike connectivity, and promoting equitable transportation mobility to achieve this goal. Respondents also argued for stronger assessments on air pollution and for addressing the disproportionate health effects on low-income and people of color communities living near high-emission roadways. They also argued for projects that reduce the number of personal vehicles on the road and for enhancing tree canopy coverage and green space. For additional priorities, participants advocated for smart growth, transit-oriented development, and supporting active transportation. For safety, participants primarily focused on improving pedestrian and bike safety and not as much car and truck, and they advocated by expanding pedestrian and bike infrastructure, bringing sidewalks up to ADA accessibility standards, increasing connectivity to transit, and reducing auto speeds to prevent accidents. Participants shared their support for maintaining and expanding the transit system to increase mode shift away from single occupancy vehicles, thus increasing bike and pedestrian safety. Many argued for separated bike facilities to make it easier and safer for anyone to bike and not just the experienced bicyclists. They advocated for improving dangerous crossings, installing light-up crosswalks, and fixing poorly timed lights and poorly painted crosswalks to reduce conflicts between pedestrians crossing the street and turning vehicles. They also promoted safe and convenient walkable routes to access schools and prioritizing safety improvements in areas with high equity populations. For system preservation and modernization, participants were asked about maintaining and improving existing sidewalks, roads, and bridges. Many focused more on improving overall safety for these roadway aspects rather than on the maintenance and improvement of specific elements of the roadway. However, when asked about maintaining the existing transit system, many picked as their top priority and added investing in transit expansion. Participants advocated for making the transit system more reliable, functional, clean, safe, and dependable to increase ridership and reduce congestion, which includes investing in maintenance and implementing dedicated bus lanes to reduce vehicles on the road. Resiliency was also frequently mentioned, but many focused more on reducing emissions for long-term investment. For capacity management and mobility, many participants advocated for creating new connections in the bike network and argued for enhanced connections to the transit system. Participants argued for more separated shared use paths. They saw increased bike infrastructure as a tool to reduce emissions, congestion, and promote public health by enhancing exercise and recreation options. Many respondents highlighted the idea of implementing more dedicated bus lanes as a way to increase reliability, enhance access to jobs, and increase equity in the transit system. Participants argued that dedicated bus lanes have a high impact for less investment and can be more flexible to meet community needs, and bus frequency can increase ridership. To reduce congestion, participants argued for more parking at commuter rail stations and enhancing walking options to commuter rail stations. They advocated for prioritizing person throughput rather than vehicle throughput, and they also argued for implementing curb allocation policies for trucks and delivery vehicles. So as I mentioned earlier, transportation equity was one of the most selected priorities. To promote more equitable transportation mobility, participants argued for many of the other priorities with a focus on directing resources to those most overburdened by transportation emissions and underserved by a lack of adequate transportation options. They argued for enhancing transportation opportunities to jobs, food, education, services, and civic engagement opportunities. They advocated for safer connections to transit options and increased transit reliability. Expanding and fixing sidewalk infrastructure was also frequently mentioned, and many argued for prioritizing projects near affordable housing, supporting transit-oriented development, and incorporating more public health criteria. Finally, to increase economic vitality, participants argued for increased transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to access jobs, services, and small businesses. Participants also argued for incorporating greater consideration for inclusionary zoning. Participants advocated for supporting projects that serve multiple municipalities and maximize mobility for all using the most efficient means possible. They also argued for climate resiliency and safety to create and maintain access to jobs and services. So for next steps, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we had planned to go back to the organizations and advocacy groups that we had worked with in the first round to share the new criteria, or the proposed new criteria, and hear feedback on the changes, as well as host pop-ups at community events. Due to the pandemic, we now plan to host virtual focus groups with all these organizations, and we also plan to release another online public survey to gauge feedback on the new draft criteria paired with a criteria, what we're calling cheat sheet, that links to supporting documents and videos of presentations to help people learn more and easily navigate information. The second round is crucial since it helps us understand if we got it right and also gives us the opportunity to see changes in priorities since the pandemic. We know that in the time of COVID-19, there's even more of a chance that we won't be able to connect with people who don't already know about the MPO. So we hope to combat this gap by investing more in our digital outreach and one-on-one follow-up with community organizations. We know that our community is experiencing deep pain from the loss in the pandemic, and that attention rightly focuses on police brutality and systemic racism. We recognize that transportation might not be at the forefront of people's thoughts. Therefore, we are working with our stakeholder groups to see what formats work best for them and what their members and constituents want to focus on. So thank you very much for your attention on this. And, does anyone have any questions that I can answer?
Any questions? Seeing none, excellent work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Can you put the agenda up, please? Next item is the project selection criteria, initial proposed system preservation modernization criteria revisions. Matt Genova.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Give me just a sec as we get set up here. So for my second presentation today, I'll walk you through the changes that we are proposing for the system preservation and modernization criteria used to evaluate prospective TIP projects. Before we start, I want to direct you to a companion table for this presentation, which has been posted to the MPO meeting calendar. Please feel free to follow along there as we talk. I also want to note that due to time constraints over the next couple of MPO meetings, we're going to work through this content fairly quickly. As Tegan noted in her executive director's report earlier today, however, we do plan to host a workshop where we can discuss these topics in more detail should we not get to all of your questions and comments today. We'll follow up with more information on that workshop in the coming days. Your feedback is also welcome at any time outside of the formal meeting setting, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me, Betsy, or Kate if you have any questions or comments on the TIP criteria or the associated outreach efforts. So this is an outline of the presentation and sort of the ground that I'm hoping to walk through today. So I'll start with some goals. We'll do a little bit of framing of the conversation and talk a little bit about some of the feedback we heard in addition to what Kate mentioned. And then we'll get into the proposed changes and next steps before turning it over to Betsy for her presentation. So beginning with the goals for today, they're really threefold. First is to provide feedback on the general direction of the system preservation criteria. So we're hoping to hear that from you today. And furthermore, if you have any additional changes or other topics for further exploration within this goal area, we're always open to hear those as well. And finally, I do hope to set the stage for today's discussion of equity, which Betsy will be doing immediately after this presentation. So starting with some framing notes for this conversation. We're really talking today about the system preservation criteria. System preservation is our second largest goal area in a tie for points with capacity management and mobility, which we'll discuss at the next MPO meeting. At 29 points, this goal area represents just under 22% of all possible points in the current TIP scoring system. So there are three objectives that were established in Destination 2040 on system preservation. The first is to maintain the transportation system, including roadway, transit, and active transportation infrastructure in a state of good repair. The second is to modernize transportation infrastructure across all modes. And the third is to prioritize projects that support planned response capability to existing or future extreme conditions, including sea level rise, flooding, and other natural and security-related man-made impacts. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the feedback we heard. Like last time, so I do want to highlight some of the feedback that we got from both the MPO as well as some other key stakeholders, including the Advisory Council and Transportation for America. So I'll be talking about those here in just a second. So through the survey that we sent out last December, we heard from MPO members that our climate resilience criteria need to be further clarified and highlighted. We also heard that the straightforward nature of the system preservation criteria are helpful in scoring projects because they clearly measure what a project does. And finally, we heard that the criteria need to place more emphasis on projects that contribute to the maintenance of the transit system. We also held an in-person criteria focus group with several MPO members back in December. At that meeting, a similar interest emerged in further rewarding projects that positively impact the transit system, as did a desire for us to think through how road conditions relate to the potential rollout of future technologies like autonomous vehicles. In other feedback, the Advisory Council responded to a survey similarly requesting that a greater weighting of the resilience criteria be explored. The Advisory Council also requested that all criteria reward projects in a scaled manner for the extent to which they improve a given problem. Finally, through our technical assistance project with Transportation for America, we heard that we should look for ways to deduct points from projects that negatively impact resiliency. They also encouraged us to reconsider the weighting of different system preservation criteria to ensure that these point values accurately reflect MPO priorities. So I'm going to dive into the key changes that we're proposing now. Again, because we're on a time crunch today, I'll go through all of the criteria at once and then turn it over to Betsy to discuss the equity scoring for system preservation. So unlike my previous presentations on this, I won't be stopping after every criterion, but will rather go through everything at once. After both Betsy and I present, we'll take whatever time remains in the meeting to have a discussion on both of our presentations together. As we move into the criteria here, I do want to give a quick thank you to several of my team members who helped put this together. Michelle Scott, Ann McGann, and Ariel Patterson all worked really diligently on shaping these recommendations, and so I do want to thank their efforts here. So here's a summary of the approach that staff took when compiling these recommendations. We sought to address both state of good repair and modernization aspects of projects. We sought to expand the resilience criteria over what we started with or what we currently have. We sought to reference asset management and resilience plans more directly. We also looked into penalizing projects in hazard zones that do not address resilience. We moved to standardize some of the methods that we use for measuring asset condition. We looked to expand the definition of critical facilities that we use in our resilience definition. And then finally, we sought to tailor the criteria to specific investment programs, which is very much an overarching theme in these revisions. So in implementing that approach, the new system preservation criteria fall into two buckets, which you see here. The first is resiliency, which includes measures of how projects incorporate resiliency elements into their designs, demonstrate regional coordination, and improve emergency response. The second bucket can broadly be called asset repair and modernization. This includes criteria that measure the extent to which projects improve existing transit assets, bridges or culverts, pavements, sidewalk and paths, and other roadway and bicycle and pedestrian assets. So our first criterion today is project incorporates resiliency elements into its design. This is a restructuring of our existing criterion titled Improves Ability to Respond to Extreme Conditions. Here, the revised version retains points for aspects like supporting resiliency plans, improving stormwater infrastructure, and protecting the freight network. The proposed criterion focuses more on sea level rise and flooding than the prior version did, which included points for other less relevant elements, like bringing a facility up to seismic design standards. The new criterion also increases the emphasis on the materials used to promote resiliency and introduces a penalty for projects that don't address resiliency in areas that are prone to flooding or sea level rise. This criterion is largely similar across investment programs, though the bicycle and pedestrian and transit modernization programs don't score for impacts to the freight network. Moving now to project demonstrates regional coordination. This is a new criterion that proposes to award points to projects that provide off-site resiliency benefits, such as reductions in downstream flooding. This criterion would also award points to proponents that demonstrate coordination with other resiliency projects outside of the project in question. This scoring would be the same across all investment programs. On to project improves emergency response. This criterion awards points to projects that improve evacuation routes and enhance connections to critical facilities. This is largely similar to the existing version of this criterion, though the definition of critical facilities is proposed to be expanded beyond the current definition, which includes police and fire stations and hospitals, to also include things like schools, long-term care facilities, utilities, and other resilience supporting facilities. This criterion would be the same across investment programs, though would not include scoring for evacuation routes in the bike ped or transit programs, as designated evacuation routes are roadways. On to improving or modernizing existing transit assets. This criterion is an expanded version of the existing one, which now includes points for both improving the condition of existing transit assets, as well as for enhancing these assets through modernization. We've also proposed adding a bonus score for improving operations critical, safety critical, or climate sensitive assets, and adding scoring potential for roadway-based transit assets like bus stops and dedicated bus lanes. This criterion would score transit modernization projects more heavily and would not be applicable to bicycle and pedestrian projects. Next is improving bridges and culverts. This criterion is also similar to the existing one, though it proposes to now include culverts and adopt the federal good, fair, poor rating system as opposed to the prior scoring, which used functional obsolescence and structural deficiency as markers for current condition. The new criterion would also award bonus points for reducing weight or height restrictions and improving structures on the national highway system or the freight network. Projects could also score additional points for improving more than one bridge or culvert. This criterion would not apply to bicycle and pedestrian projects, as we do not see reconstruction of those bridges very often in that program. Moving to improving pavement condition, which uses a similar approach to bridges by moving to the federal good, fair, poor scale and awarding bonus points for improving pavement on certain key facilities. In addition, this proposal would add points for improving a roadway's substructure, as some projects do this, while others only reclaim pavement through a mill and overlay in the project process. This criterion would not apply to bicycle and pedestrian projects or transit projects and would feature a lower point scale for intersection projects, as these projects tend to reconstruct significantly less pavement than do corridor projects. Next is improving existing sidewalks and paths, which we propose to move from a condition-based score to a quantity-based score. Currently, we rely largely on project proponents to describe the existing sidewalk condition in the project area as good, fair, or poor, and then award points based on the degree of improvements. Because hard data on sidewalk condition isn't usually readily available during the project evaluation process, we propose moving to a scoring scale that rewards projects for the percentage of existing sidewalk within a project area that is reconstructed as a part of the project. This criterion would feature higher point values within the bicycle and pedestrian program to acknowledge the importance of reconstructing those facilities specifically within that program. Finally, the last criterion of the day, improving other existing roadway or bicycle and pedestrian assets. This is a revised version of the current traffic signals criterion, which is proposed here to be expanded to include additional roadway elements like guardrails, lighting, and pavement markings. The main reason for this change is that good data on the existing condition of traffic signals doesn't really exist, so a criterion that relies solely on signal condition is difficult to measure. This criterion would be scaled down, scaled based on the number of assets a project improves and would not apply to transit modernization projects. That's it for the criteria, so I'll move briefly through some next steps before handing it off to Betsy. Today, we're obviously talking about the system preservation goal area, and we'll be discussing the equity scoring for that here shortly. As we move into July, at the July 16th MPO meeting, we'll discuss the capacity management goal area. Sorry, looks like I lost the slide there, but in August, we'll be coming back and discussing the economic vitality criteria, and we'll also get into some draft test scoring of current tier projects to give you a sense of how the criteria revisions will impact the scores of currently programmed projects. though we are not proposing to reprogram anything. This is just more of a test run to see how the criteria are working. Oh, there we go. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Betsy to discuss how equity applies to the system preservation criteria.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to talk about how we plan to evaluate equity in the context of the system preservation and modernization goal area. I've presented twice on our equity evaluation proposal and other goal areas, so I'm going to focus less on that and more on addressing some of the questions that MPO members have raised in the last couple of presentations. So I'm going to first talk about the proposed system preservation and modernization criteria that we plan to evaluate for impacts on equity populations, and then give us some summary of feedback and some future key decision points for the MPO to think about going forward as we decide how to approach equity in the criteria. As you may remember, the proposal is to have two parallel processes, one being to evaluate the criteria in each goal area that we choose to be equity criteria. For example, we may choose the improves ability to respond to extreme conditions criteria, and we would evaluate as we normally do and come up with a base score. The second process is then to identify the equity populations in the project area in order to come up with our equity multiplier. And then we would multiply that by the base score to come up with the final score for that criteria. So for each goal area, we're going to choose a subset of the criteria to evaluate. And for system preservation and modernization, we propose to evaluate the four criteria kind of highlighted there: the improves transit assets, improves ability to respond to extreme conditions, improves emergency response, and improves substandard sidewalks. And we chose those criteria for several reasons. We heard these needs that were identified in the LRDP needs assessment through public outreach and data analysis as critical for equity populations. And then in our outreach for the TIP, as Matt and Kate alluded to, we also heard in particular the need for improved transit infrastructure, especially around bus stops, and the need for improved and accessible sidewalks. So I'm going to kind of leave that to the side for you to think about, and I want to circle back for a few minutes to some of the feedback I received last week and in earlier presentations from folks at the MPO. So there seem to be two main areas of interest regarding potential adjustments to the criteria for the equity component. First, folks suggested that the criteria address the fact that different demographic groups may benefit differently from various types of transportation improvements. For example, low-income populations without access to a car may not fully benefit from roadway projects. Now, of course, not all people with low incomes rely on public transit, so I'm looking into the intersection between different populations to better understand their transportation needs. Secondly, there is also the suggestion that the criteria address existing inequities in the transportation system. And we know that in the past and currently, transportation investments are not always equitable, leading to adverse impacts that have disproportionately affected, in particular, people of color and people with low incomes. And this can range from anything from longer travel times to greater exposure to auto emissions, among others. So we can think about how we can use the criteria to directly address those issues. So I want to take a moment to talk about that first topic, looking at the intersection between different population characteristics. You can think of equity populations as having one or more indicators of potential transportation disadvantage. So a person that falls into one equity demographic suggests some transportation disadvantage, but someone who falls into multiple equity demographics suggests increasingly significant transportation disadvantage. And so I looked at the intersection between low income and minority populations, as well as the share of those populations without access to a vehicle. And this table on this slide shows the percent of the low income population in the region that is also minority. So 53% of people who are considered low income, i.e. those whose income are below 200% of the national poverty level, also identify as minority. For comparison, about 28% of the population in our region is minority. So what this tells us is that people of color are far more likely to have low incomes. I also looked at the percent of the population in the region that is both minority and who do not have access to a personal vehicle. 52% of those without access to a personal vehicle are minority, which again is a pretty high overrepresentation compared to the share of the population in the region who identify as minority. And then finally, I looked at the intersection between low income population and people who don't have access to a personal vehicle. And again, kind of similar to the pattern we just saw, 58% of those without access to a personal vehicle are considered low income. And for reference, 23% of the population in our region are considered low income. So just to give you some idea of kind of some of the intersection between various equity populations, and I'll continue to look more into other intersections of different demographic groups going forward, but I wanted to give you some response to some of the feedback I heard last time. So thinking about where we could address those suggestions that I just mentioned. I don't want to discuss those in detail right now, but I want to put them on your radar as you think about decisions that need to be made going forward, and we can talk about them more in detail this summer as we reevaluate projects, as Matt mentioned. The first thing to think about is how equity population should be weighed relative to each other. And this could address the acknowledgement that multiple equity indicators suggest potential increasing transportation disadvantage, as well as accounting for the likelihood that some populations may benefit from particular types of projects than others. And the second thing to consider is how the equity goal area could be weighed relative to the other goal areas. And this can help the MPO target specific criteria or goal areas for which we want to address particularly critical existing transportation inequities. So I'll leave you with those questions and points to consider and think about. And at the next presentation on the July 16th meeting, I should be able to come back with more information regarding the questions and suggestions that folks brought up in previous meetings and anything that's brought up today. So with that, I'll take any questions or feedback, as well as if you have any questions for Matt as well about his presentation.
Thank you both. Questions from MPO members? Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't want to sound like I am hammering on the points, the number of points that are given to transportation to equity versus other categories. I like where we're going with incorporating equity into all the categories. I think that is definitely worth exploring the way we're doing it. But with respect to the number of points though that are given for system preservation, and I know we're going to talk about the other big category next in one of the other meetings. Are the number of points a function of the number of categories that we're looking at? I'm just trying to get a sense of why it is any given category ends up with so many points and thereby such a big percentage of the number of points that are given under consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy. Oh, sorry. Yeah, happy to take that question. So yeah, it is a function of a couple of things. I mean, one is certainly the number of criteria within any given goal area. So in this case, there are 8 criteria within the system preservation goal area, and that's obviously a fairly high number of criteria to score, and so points tend to add up pretty quickly, although some of the criteria are really only a couple of points apiece. And so that's definitely one of the things that we can come back to later in July and into August is, getting a sense for, are there places where we can condense some of these criteria back down if we feel like there are too many, or, reducing the point values for any given criterion to, sort of highlight the extent to which, certain criteria over others might be more of a priority in determining the overall score of a project. And so, yeah, so I mean, I guess the short answer is really that this is totally open for discussion. I mean, our starting point is that system preservation and capacity management mobility are both, pretty high at 29 points. Safety is our highest at 30, and then the 3 other goal areas fall below that. But that's certainly not set in stone. And so as a part of this process, we can discuss if those allocations make sense or if we want to, sort of reallocate points to other goal areas.
Thank you, Matt.
Samantha?
So I have 2 comments and a question. First comment is that the system preservation criteria are looking really good. Matt, kudos to you and Anne and the rest of the team, Michelle, that are taking this on, because I think the emphasis on resilience is great. The kind of mode specific items make a lot of sense. My other comment is that on the last item, the kind of other impacts, I think you potentially could apply that to transit modernization projects, because there are some projects like station improvements that do include things like crosswalks, sometimes also traffic signals, signage, kind of other parts of the surrounding roadway infrastructure. And so, if it made sense to staff, I can, I think that could be applied. And then one question is, how are you defining hazard zones? Is that just flood risk, or are you also thinking about other climate and environmental criteria?
Yeah, I guess, thank you for the kudos, and thank you for the point on the other assets as well. And that's something we can, follow up with you and see if there are some tweaks we need to make to make sure that we're sort of adequately accounting for potential transit modernization projects. So I appreciate you raising that. And then to answer your question, so right now the hazards are basically, basically flood risk and projected sea level rise. And so those are really what we're looking at as a part of that scoring criterion is, is a project in an area that either currently has a flood risk or is projected to have a flood risk due to, inland flooding or sea level rise issues. And, if a project isn't addressing that in a real way, then that's where the point deduction would happen. But we can certainly expand that definition if you have other thoughts on ways to broaden it.
Does that tie into any of the discussion about emissions or communities overburdened by pollution or greenhouse gas emissions, or is that captured elsewhere in the criteria?
Yeah, so it does not include it in this criterion, but that is captured in the Clean Air and Sustainable Communities goal area, where we did propose, I know this is sort of jumping back several months now, but we did propose adding some extra points for projects that reduce or that improve air quality in places that have above average concentrations of PM 2.5. And so that's one way we're looking to address places that currently are overburdened with air pollution issues. And again, that's also, open for discussion. So if there are other ways that we can take that into account, we're certainly happy to have more feedback on that.
Okay, no, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Others? Seeing none. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is member items. Do any members have any items to come before the MPO at this time? John Romano. John?
Having an issue with unmuting here.
All right. Does anybody else have any items while we're waiting to see if we're going to get John unmuted? Eric Barassa.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note, next week, MAPC is going to be hosting a webinar jointly with MassDOT staff. So folks from Mass Development and from the Operational Services Department to talk about shared streets, MassDOT Shared Streets program, and learning about some state contracts that are available for cities and towns to purchase materials off of. And also, the Bar Foundation is funding some technical support for municipalities as well. I believe that is on Tuesday, June 30th at 2 p.m. That information should be on our website. If it's not, it will be updated shortly.
Thank you, Eric. Were you able to get John Romano unmuted?
I was.
Can you hear me?
Yes, John.
I just wanted to just say that the first couple of votes, I voted yes, even though you couldn't hear me. So if you want to reflect that in the record.
Thank you, John. On the minutes, can you show John voting yes? And
thank you.
Lynn Diggins?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is so out of order that if you don't want to do it, I understand. But if Kate White is still around, I just had a question about one part of her presentation. I didn't ask at the time because I was afraid the meeting would run long, but I think we have a little time. Would that be okay?
Sure.
All right.
Kate, are you still on? I think you are.
Yes, hi.
Hi,
Yeah,
Kate.
Here, go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah. So the income distributions, of the respondents was just so skewed, I'm just wondering, is there anything you think we can do about that when surveying people? Because I'm even a little, even though Arlington was a community that participated a lot, I don't know if you have a breakdown for the income responses of the Arlington residents, but I'm just so concerned that we're not, getting people with low income, and just anything you think we might be able to do about that, even if it's for the members of the MPO to help in some way in reaching out to people in our communities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Len. So the way that we calculated income, we asked people for their whole household income. And so like if you had 3 roommates that were making, between 30 and 50,000, you could get up to about 100,000, which is one of the thresholds. So I think it does make it hard for calculating some of the income of the individuals. But the way that we measure poverty, we kind of collect household income and then we compare it to household income size. So in the memo, we kind of compare that and talk about if you have a 4-person household, what's the threshold? But to your other question is that, one of my goals is to also make sure that we're really reaching out to everyone and that they're, if there are ways that the MPO members can help us, we would love that. And especially during this time when it is harder to go out and do the pop-ups where you might meet with people who, work different times of the day or, might be picking kids up from school and things like that. And so if there's efforts that, we'll send something out afterwards, but if the MPO members can send it out to their networks and their communities, we'd really appreciate that.
Thank you. That's it for me. Thanks. Appreciate it. Sure.
No worries, Lynn. Any other comments or member items at this time? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second from an MPO member to adjourn, and please state your name. Eric Barassa.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Tom Bent.
And I second that motion.
Without objection, we are adjourned. We'll see you all, I think, July 16th. Have a great couple of weeks. Bye, everybody.